So today's speakers include, I'm just going to do sort of an introduction for everyone now because that'll allow us to just flow through the presentations afterwards. Our speakers today include Trevor Murdock, who's a climate scientist with the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium in Victoria, where he leads the regional climate impacts theme. And Trevor has spent over 20 years working on applied climate science to assist decision-making and planning. And those of you who are working on adaptation in BC probably have run into Trevor in one time or another. So he provided a lot of the information that fed into these regional impacts reports. Second speaker is Lillian Zaremba, who's a professional engineer with 15 years of experience in the fields of water, energy, and climate. And she currently investigates opportunities to recover energy from Metro Vancouver's water and wastewater systems and manages research projects, including projected impacts of climate change in the region. Next speaker is Nicky Elliott, who's the Climate Action Program Coordinator at the Capital Regional District in Victoria. And she supports the local governments, the 13 of them that are part of the region, as well as 3 electoral areas, in developing and implementing emissions reduction and adaptation strategies, and undertaking climate change monitoring, citizen engagement, and community partnership activities. The third community speaker is Kate Miller, who's a manager of environmental services at the Cowichan Valley Regional District. And she's an environmental planner by trade, focused on the integration of environmental data in both land use planning, engineering, and within the larger community. And then our last speaker is Jillian Obi-Vines, who was the writer for all of 3 of the regional reports that were prepared. And Jillian's the founding principal of PINA Sustainability. She has over 15 years experience supporting transition towards sustainability. And over her career, Jill has worked on numerous climate mitigation and adaptation projects with local, provincial, and federal government agencies, as well as climate science folks like PK. So I'm going to, at this point, hand things over to Trevor. Who's our first speaker.
All right. Is that showing up for everyone? I'm going to dive right in. Let me know if you're not seeing the slides, but so we're looking at, what's that?
It looks good.
Okay. So yeah, just to set the context of climate change in BC, and before we hear from what this means for local government, what we're looking at here is in black. This black line on the left half of the figure is historical temperatures averaged over all of BC and then averaged over each year. So you see this kind of wiggly line where you have some cold years and some warm years. If you look closely at what some of the years are, you'll see that we've had a couple of record-breaking hot years the last 2 years on the figure. 2003 Kelowna wildfire year is on there as one of the warmest years on record. Some of the coldest years there are associated with, lots of flooding on the Fraser. So a couple of degrees different averaged over the whole year and over the whole province. It has a big impact on the landscape. And when we get the animations going here, so we have this sort of distribution. We've got this sort of bell curve of cold and hot years. And what we're looking at in these 3 future projections, so these are following different emissions scenarios. So focusing for now on the sort of business as usual, not very much in terms of reducing our emissions. This is the RCP 8.5. If you slide that bell curve up toward the end of the century, what you see is a climate where the extremely cold years that happen in future that are so cold, weird things on the landscape happen. Those are actually warmer than anything we've experienced historically. So warmer than these last couple of record-breaking hot years. So that's, sometimes the new normal was in the news a lot this last year, but this wasn't the new normal. This is the new extremely cold under that scenario. So Under some of the lower emission scenarios, especially this, so this blue line is RCP 2.6. This is the sort of aspirational goal of Paris. This is, it's a sort of in between the 1.5 and 2 Celsius global numbers. We just had this report on the difference between 1.5 and 2 Celsius, and this blue line is around that. And so even under that scenario, we're looking at there actually is a normal. We get sort of stable climate towards the last half of the century there, but that's about equivalent to these record-breaking hot years we've had these last couple of years. So we're still going to need to adapt to that, even if we can, get to sort of 80% emission reductions within a couple of decades, and then figure out a way of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. That blue line does require that. So how do we translate that into planning? So one of the things we make sense of, one of the ways it can make sense of this massive difference between the worst case and better case scenarios there is to just focus on the middle of the century. So for a lot of adaptation planning, and we'll see a focus in all of these reports on the middle of the century. The difference between at least the top two scenarios here is a lot less in the middle of the century than towards the end of the century. And what's definitely the case is that both of these lines are quite different from just using historical data. So showing that black line there, that's the period that's in the current BC Building Code. And so we're sort of missing making use of the best information if we design for that historical period that's no longer going to happen. So making that local, here's the sort of climate scientist's perspective of these three regional districts we're going to hear from. And just this is one of many parameters that folks looked at. This is the number of days, this is the increase in the number of days above 25 Celsius. And depending where you are, it's about a double or tripling. And I use this one because from my perspective as a climate scientist, that looks like kind of the same message throughout each of these three regions. And then we're now going to hear from each of the folks involved in these three reports and how much the location that was doing the adaptation planning mattered, and how much that context is important in interpreting the future projections. That's it for me. Now, Jim, you have a question to activate between?
Yeah, I'll just a quick poll question as we're doing the transition. So we'd just like to also know, in addition to where folks are from, is what type of organization you work with. And looks like lots of people have had a chance to fill that out, so we'll just close that and share the results. So we've got really strong attendance on this webinar, largest contingent from local governments or First Nations, followed by provincial or federal, and the others. So that's great. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. So we're just going to hand things over to Lillian Zaremba from Metro Vancouver.
Thanks, Jim. Showing?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay. So first, I'll start with a really brief introduction to Metro Vancouver. Metro Vancouver is a region consisting of 21 municipalities, 1 Treaty First Nation, and 1 electoral area. And it's home to over 2.4 million people, and the communities range from dense urban centers to agricultural areas. Metro Vancouver is a regional government that provides services including drinking water, wastewater treatment, solid waste management, air quality management, and regional planning. We also coordinate regional planning for food system security and ecosystem services. And our role in climate change has focused on corporate activities so far, but is being expanded into a regional climate strategy, and I'll describe a bit about that later. So why did we update our climate projections? Well, our strategic plans and management plans emphasized climate change as a priority in all of the work that we do at Metro. And our efforts to understand how the future climate will look in our region specifically have been ongoing since the early 2000s. So after the latest IPCC report was released in 2014, we decided to update the projections based on this latest science. And the main desire was to develop a common set of projections for consistency among all our departments in planning and design. And originally, we intended the audience to be engineering staff in both the drinking water and liquid waste departments. So I come from the utilities side of our organization, and their counterparts in the member municipalities. Through conversation, we broadened the audience to include the planners in our regional planning department. So it was still a technical audience, and that was the germination of this report. And since Metro Vancouver was the first one to do this report, the next few slides will run through the process of producing the report and what we learned along the way. So as the first ones to undertake this with PCIC, based on the latest climate models, there was a lot of upfront effort to scope the project. And PCIC was advising us on the best approach along the way. For example, the importance of using multiple climate models, general circulation models, or global climate models in an ensemble approach to generating the projections. And one of our first decisions, you'll recognize this slide is similar to Trevor's slide, one of our first decisions was deciding which emission scenario we should use in generating these future projections. And based on the guidance of PCIC, we decided to use RCP 8.5, so that red band at the top, the business as usual pathway. And right now, in the face of many unknowns and a lack of global action, it's really prudent to plan for this RCP 8.5 future, especially when we're building infrastructure that's going to last 100 years or so. So the climate models, the data that comes out of the climate models can be sliced and diced into dozens of indices, and we wanted to select a subset of indices that would paint the whole picture, but without overwhelming staff. So we interviewed staff to find out what kinds of climate data they would use in their planning and design and operations. And with a lot of back and forth with Trevor and our staff to decide on the final set of indices, we came up with this list that covers all the pertinent impacts that we saw in the region. During our consultation with colleagues, it also gave us an opportunity to educate them about climate science. So lots of people know about climate change in general, but we were digging into things like emission scenarios, global climate models, how downscaling works, how we can't assign probabilities to those future projections. And the biggest thing was overcoming the desire to provide a single number for future design. So engineers need to get comfortable with uncertainty and using a range of future projections, applying a risk management approach to design. After PCIC finished the modeling and analysis, Trevor recommended that we hire a writer rather than relying on ourselves, a climate scientist and an engineer, to do the writing. And we also realized the report could be valuable to other audiences beyond our technical, initial idea of our technical audience. For example, our elected officials and the broader public might be interested in this. So we hired Jillian at PINA, who you'll hear from later, to translate this highly technical material into understandable language. Still technical, but it's readable and tells the story. Finally, our graphics department designed the document for publication, and we began presenting the results to our staff and municipal staff, committees and board committees. And this report that was originally intended to be just a technical document for staff was really evolving into something else. I started receiving requests for presentations from external bodies who had heard about the report through word of mouth. So for example, Engineers and Geoscientists BC at a sustainability panel, or the BC WWA conference. So it was getting legs. Since we'd actually intended this document to be used internally, we didn't plan a media release. We did post it on our website, buried in a climate change page, and somehow the media picked it up 5 months after it was posted, sort of out of the blue. It made the front page of the province and the Vancouver Sun. It led to interviews on Global TV and CBC Morning Radio. And some of the media coverage was a little sensational and misrepresented some results. So the headline said, "In the future, Metro Vancouver will be like present-day San Diego." Well, that is true for one indicator, the summer daytime high temperature, and we gave that comparison in the report. But we won't be at all like San Diego for winter temperature or precipitation. And of course, with most news stories, there isn't much room for nuance and digging into this. So we learned our lesson that we could have been proactive and better control the messaging by issuing a media release ourselves. Now I'll present a quick snapshot of some of the major impacts we're expecting in the region and how we're using the report for adaptation planning. So first of all, for water supply and demand, the majority of Metro Vancouver's drinking water comes from our mountain reservoirs that are fed by rainfall and snowmelt. The warmer temperatures in the future will erode that snowpack that we usually depend on to contribute to water supply in spring and summer. And with hotter summers, there might be more demand for outdoor water use. So this combination of decreased supply and increased demand could strain our water supply. Metro Vancouver is in the midst of completing a comprehensive regional water system strategy, and the climate projections report was the basis for two parts of the strategy. First, the downscaled climate data from PCIC was used for detailed hydrologic modeling of the source watersheds to evaluate the future reliability of the water supply. And second, a PIVC, the acronym is the Protocol Engineering Vulnerability Committee. Sorry, I've lost the exact acronym there. So PIVC vulnerability assessment used the climate indicators from this report to determine the resilience of all of our infrastructure within the water system in a changing climate. And outside of Metro Vancouver, the Sunshine Coast Regional District also used our projections for one of their water supply projects that was quite close to the boundary of our region, so they could extrapolate from our results. On the wastewater side, the rainfall indicators show future extreme events will be more frequent and more intense than infrastructure is designed for. So if stormwater were to continue being managed by our current sewers, we might expect flooding and property damage. And also in the case of combined sewers, we might see combined sewer overflows. Metro Vancouver and our member municipalities do have a sewer separation program for those areas with combined sewers. That will take decades, and all of the future sewers are being designed to accommodate the projected future precipitation volumes. And we recently did a follow-on study of specifically climate impacts on precipitation and stormwater, and PCIC served as advisors on that study. So this originated from those earlier interviews with staff about their climate data needs, and we kept hearing requests for future IDF curves, or intensity, duration, frequency curves for rainfall. And climate models aren't yet at the point where they can model short duration precipitation, so less than 1 day in duration. So we needed to make various assumptions, did some pretty great climate science on this, and analyzed the sensitivity of the precipitation projections to the future sources of uncertainty, so lots of uncertainty in the future. And we developed moderate and high future scenarios that we can now use in planning for those shorter duration precipitation events. And the report is also being used by practitioners beyond our original audience of water and wastewater engineers and planners. So warmer temperatures will cause shifts in energy demand. Good news on the winter heating side, we won't need as much heat, but buildings will need to be designed and retrofitted for increased cooling demand in the summer. So this report has spurred requests from energy managers at the Vancouver School Board and UBC regarding their future need for cooling. And health authority staff who manage facilities in the Lower Mainland are using our report to design resilient facilities for the health system. The report describes many impacts on ecosystems that you can read about in the report. As one example, drier summers and higher temperatures will cause stress to trees and plants. And the projections inform the development of an urban forest climate adaptation framework for tree species selection, planting, and management in Metro Vancouver. So that will be used by our member municipalities in planting street trees, for example, or planting in parks. Metro Vancouver is currently developing a Climate 2050 strategy. This covers both adaptation and mitigation in both the organization and across the region. And the vision is that Metro Vancouver will ensure infrastructure, ecosystems, and communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change, and will pursue a regional target of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2007 levels by 2050. For the organization, This applies to actions that Metro Vancouver can control directly, so through our assets, operations, and staff. And for the region, the strategy will cover actions that Metro Vancouver can support and influence for residents and businesses, and coordinate actions across our member municipalities, and clarify roles of Metro versus municipalities and other levels of government, along with the private sector and the public. And generating the Regional Climate Projections Report was an important foundation piece for developing this strategy by painting that picture of the future that we do need to prepare for and the imperative to take action now. So the biggest role of this Climate Projections Report has really been to set the stage for future adaptation planning. It provides a broad foundation, and other more detailed studies can build on it, but it's a very important foundation piece. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Lillian. And our next speaker is Nicky Elliott, who's going to talk about the Capital Regional District's experience in developing a similar regional report. But before we go to Nicky, we'll just go to our next poll here, which is we're interested in whether you've used climate projections reports that Metro Vancouver, Capital Region, or the Cowichan Valley Regional District have developed, if you've used those in your work. We'd also be interested if you have, to tell us a little bit about how you use them. Use the question box to do that, and we'll share that information with the whole group. And if you haven't, if you're in a different region and these don't really apply to you, we'd also be interested in whether you think a product like this would be useful in your work. So you can continue responding to the question. We'll close the poll after people have voted, but you can continue to respond to the question after, as Nicky begins her presentation. Okay, well, this is good to see. So we've got quite a, sorry, that one response was supposed to be not at all. Thanks everybody for bearing with us. But yeah, it looks like a number of people haven't at all, or they're from a different region, but it's good to see that that some of you are from these regions and have found value from them. But it helps us to know who's on the other end here, who's listening, and that can help our speakers adapt their presentation. So we will just pass things over now to Nicky to give her perspective on the Capital Regional District's experience.
Great, thank you. We're fine there?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, so thanks everyone for having me. Nicky Elliott, the Climate Action Program Coordinator at the Capital Regional District. For those that aren't local, the CRD, the Capital Region, we consist of 13 municipalities, 3 electoral areas, 11 First Nations, population just shy of 400,000, and as you can see, over 200,000 hectares of land, including 70 different islands here in southern Vancouver Island. We also, like Metro Van, we're a very diverse region. From rural resource lands, we have agriculture, urban centers. We're the home of the provincial government. We have the Navy here, and lots of institutions. And the organization of the Capital Regional District, we are 25, governed by a 25 or 24 member board, and we, like Metro Van, we serve our local governments and our electoral areas through a number of services around wastewater and drinking water, regional parks. We handle the landfilling. We do lots of environmental protection, emergency preparedness, and lots of education and outreach. And we are a large land and asset owner as well. The Climate Action Service, in which I manage, we are one of those 200 services, a small but mighty one, that really our function is to support regional climate action, both both related to mitigation and adaptation. How we do that is through supporting our local governments and electoral areas. We do some education and outreach. We support the CRD. We liaise with senior levels of government, and one of those other pieces of our mandate is to provide regional data and indicators. So a natural fit to undergoing this process around the climate projections. So why did we embark on this exercise? Well, like MetroVan, we have guiding plans. Climate change or advancing climate change action was identified as a board strategic priority at the last election. We had a number of internal documents that spoke to refining climate data. We have a corporate climate action strategy, a regional, which is sort of the outward community-facing one, as well as we work very closely with our intermunicipal network, and it was identified as sort of ongoing. There's a role for the CRD, the Climate Action Service, to support refining that climate information. I will also say, because MetroVan had went through the process, the stars aligned too, that we were able to sort of leverage their work quite a bit, as you will see, as I explain sort of our process as well. So similar to MetroVan, again, the purpose of the report was to develop this common set of local temperature and precipitation projections, and really signal where those impacts would be regionally or locally here in the capital region, and to identify further study. We worked very closely with Trevor at PKIC to inform sort of the process, building off that Metro Vancouver example, which really guided and helped to sort of lay out. They did a lot of sort of the groundwork around the process and the foundational elements to the document, and we were very grateful to be able to leverage that. So internally, like MetroVan, we brought together a core project team, and we were able to fund it utilizing a bunch of the services across the organization, those that had an interest in this. So that team represented folks from our integrated water services, so our watershed protection, drinking watershed protection group, our landfill or environmental resource management group, our environmental engineering group, we had a rep from regional parks, from our electoral area planning and our regional plannings. We had a risk person on our team as well as some of our emergency managers and others, trying to get sort of that diverse perspective about how to form what's in the document. CVRD, which you're going to speak to, or Kate's going to speak next after me, they embarked on a process at similar timing. As you'll learn, they did theirs in a different way, but really we were able to sort of, get some movement based on that. We were kind of embarking on this process together. And of course, the technical contributions from PKIC and PINA. So our report, similar to MetroVan, if you look at the table of contents, we have about 24 indices, climate indices, explained or included in there. Like I said, we were able to sort of work off of the example of MetroVan to see if those made sense. The same climate indicators made sense for our region and for our planning and for our functions here. The one on the slide you see here is showing the winter minimum temperature up to the in the 2050 scenario, showing basically in the 2050 scenario we're unlikely to see days below zero. So taking away those frost days. There was, when you look and you dig into the report, which I encourage everybody after, is there was a really concerted effort to make the report as easily understood as possible, recognizing the audience really is professionals, biologists, engineers, planners, all those that were on the project team, but that you could read it and really understand what the indicator means and how you can potentially apply that to your work, and with a description of what those projections, what the results are. The report also includes a bit of a discussion on what that means, I guess, for the regional impacts. So really, this portion of the report the intent is to, help to focus some discussions around sort of the project team and other regional stakeholders, really give the opportunity to dive into the results and really tailor the report for the local needs. it was a great kind of excuse to educate folks around climate projection and what that means on the ground, and really connect the dots, especially for those that are less familiar with climate data. So when you read that section, there's a few paragraphs around each of these regional impacts that really, the intent is to, kind of identify how that connects to different folks' work. And I won't go over sort of a lot of those regional impacts. Lillian did a great example of sort of how, from a local government perspective, what many of those were, and that was very similar to sort of our report as well. I'd encourage again to read those. There we go. So learning off the MetroVan example, we did try to, shape the message a little bit more from guidance from Lillian and team and Trevor. So we did have an info bulletin. We had information on our website when it was released. When we took, as per the internal CRD process, this document went through our board and our board process, and so we brought together a formal presentation. Trevor and Jillian came in and presented to the board so that we could get the facts straight and answer any questions. We've done a number of presentations, this is just like Lillian, across the community to our municipal networks and some community groups. And then we got a little bit of in-kind media with ours. And we did not mention San Diego in our report at all. So since release of the report, it is available on our website publicly. It's been formally provided to municipal councils, municipal staff, and within the CRD departments. And so we know that people have been using them since the data since it's been released about a year and a bit ago. Internally, our drinking watershed, our watershed protection group is utilizing it to look at compare, magnitude of changes in climate with the variation observed that they have, existing data over the 100-year record they have, and other things to inform their climate adaptation strategy. Our landfill has used it for a water balance model. Our environmental engineering group is using it to update their sewer model bylaw analysis. We have a green infrastructure guidelines that are sort of public for municipalities. They've been incorporated corporately. We do a climate lens review on major infrastructure projects. This is one of the tools to use that for. We know many municipalities here in the region are advancing their adaptation plans or updating their climate action plans in general. And so they're being actively used to inform that. For our own education and outreach around climate projections, what does the future climate mean? Definitely been using them there. And like the Lower Mainland Island Health, use them for some vulnerability mapping and building designs. Some municipalities have been using for sewer master plan. So these are the ones I know about. Private sector, we know a golf course, a consultant used them to inform a golf course stormwater management plan. So lots of sort of diverse users of this. I wholeheartedly admit that I don't know all of them that are being used because it is publicly available. The report, for depending on sort of how people are diving into it, sometimes they come back to us, folks come back to us trying to get specific indicators or more information on that, and we wholly encourage that because we have some data on the back end that can share to inform some of the work. So yeah, and then next steps around this, we continue to share. We get calls here and there about presenting on it again when different groups are ready to do adaptation planning or to inform a study, or they're looking for more detailed data related to the report. We've been developing using some work that Kate did and others around sort of distilling this information into a publicly accessible version. So we're doing, these indicator or these graphics and including them in some of our reports and some of our outreach materials. And as the Climate Action Services mandate, we will continue to support further study in this sphere. So I think that is it. The report is available, like I said, on our website. There it is there, /data in the climate section there. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Nikki. Very useful and interesting, how I guess we were all chatting as we were planning this around how the different regions, even though there's a lot of similarities in the climate, approach the project differently, and also there are different issues. So one of the questions we have for those of you who are joining us on the webinar today is, kind of what sort of sector are you most involved in? Whoops, sorry. And what we mean here is, what we noticed with the 3 different regions is that, certainly with Metro Vancouver, it's largely urban issues and infrastructure, whereas as you get into the more, some of the other regional districts, there's a combination of urban issues and rural issues that people are dealing with. There's some, cities or more dense areas where there are more urban and infrastructure issues, and there may be parts of your region where there's things like natural resource management are much more important to residents there. Okay, so I think I'll just close this poll. People have responded here, so we'll just share the results. So yeah, this is interesting. I think it looks like there's a really strong contingent of you who are more focused on rural issues and natural resources, or working on both issues equally, urban and rural. So that's really valuable to know, and that fits in well with our next presenter, Kate Miller from the Cowichan Valley Regional District, where those rural issues and natural resource issues are much more prominent than the other 2 regions. So we will switch things over to her. And we'll just hide the results there.
Perfect. So can you see me?
Can't see you quite yet, but we can hear you. You just have to accept the control there.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, looks great.
Okay, so that was actually a great segue. We're quite different than the other 2 presenters insofar as we're primarily rural in nature and very, very close to smaller government, obviously, so very close to both the politicians and the community. So we took a very different approach in terms of how we do it. Vantage point is everything, and we think that it's really about who's on the journey with you and the direction that you're looking in, and taking that journey as a group quite often really helps us move forward within our own organization and to get some support. So when we started this original process, many of our political leadership had real questions about climate change and whether or not it was actually an issue that we should be addressing. So that's kind of the context in terms of how we approached it in the beginning. Oh, we can. There we are. So our goal was really focused on adaptation, not mitigation, in terms of the overall strategy itself, just recognizing some of those political nuances. We really wanted to make sure that the vulnerabilities were understood. That helped us kind of pull in the community in many ways, and focused on public safety as much as possible in terms of trying to make sure that it was really a cross-sectoral approach. And as many of you, by the sounds of it, identified that the rural and the resource areas are a major player, and we really wanted to invite them into the process as well. So that it wasn't around 2 different perspectives in terms of moving forward, but really problem solving as a group. And obviously to make sure that it wasn't just a strategy that was very large in language, aspirational, but was really drawn from a deep understanding of the science as it emerged. So the same with Nicky. It was part of our regional priorities as set out by the board when they first started their period of time, 2014 to 2018. These were sort of their direction to us at the time. Unfortunately, it didn't come with either staffing or financial support. And so we really used this process to build through basically kind of a stone soup model to try to develop really specific targets, and that helped us find funding to continue the program and to drill down in other areas, as well as bringing other partners into the process that helped kind of move it forward. I think the one really positive piece of it, we're just finishing our reporting for the 2018 period in preparation of the new board coming in, that I think that we've, for all intents and purposes, made very major strides in all of these particular areas, particularly around the very structured integration of the projections into our asset management strategies. The adaptation strategy from the community perspective has some very clear, specific issues with regards to keeping the community safe from ongoing and very rapidly changing hazards. And as of this year, we have yet again met our climate neutral goals within the organization, at least corporately. So there's all positive components that helps kind of move that momentum forward, which is important to us, right? So we have to show progress. We have to show that the progress is actually beneficial to the organization, and to find ways to make it as transparent as possible, particularly at a small community level where we're very, very close to the public, who has, especially in this last election and the one prior, raised extreme concerns with the cost of government and being able to see actual strategic outcomes coming out of it that benefit them directly in terms of their potential reduction of costs ultimately. So science and evidence-based process for us so that we can monitor change over time, really recognizing that as a very small local government with myself and two others who address both stormwater management, liquid waste management, environmental planning, conservation planning, and climate work, we really need to draw on the collaborative partnership of our communities, and to continue the discussion to break down some of those barriers, to learn ourselves, but also learn with others, was a really important part of the process to us. So changing those sort of social norms in terms of the organization, but also the larger community. The other thing is, when we started this process, we spent a little bit of time looking at why other plans had failed, why we've got, over 300 plus master plans on our bookshelves that never get taken down, and we've got new staff coming on board who basically don't even bother looking at them. They just create new ones. As we wanted to make sure that the climate projections were embedded going forward in everything we do, simply embedded into an ethic of continuous improvement, so that people didn't start to look at it as, oh, it's another lens, it's another impediment to doing my work, but it was simply a component that they never addressed anymore. It's almost as if they wonder, well, do we have a plan? I thought that was just the kind of the approach that we took. So we really want to make sure that it's implemented in every approach that we take, but also the vulnerability and the risk assessment is part of the new language within the organization. And so that becomes the norm in terms of asking the question, is there something that we can do here around adjusting our way of doing business? The other piece is to just constantly ensure that every sub-plan, every new activity always goes back and amends and updates those projections or the learns and retests it on an ongoing basis. So our comment in terms of the wise practice, at least in a rural environment where there's a lot of pressure to go in multiple directions, is to really do it alone. Quite often we recognize that we can't do it ourselves. We have to sort of pull back from being at the leading edge of something and allow our partners to be champions that we can share the load with, and still keep that level of excitement as we sort of play leapfrog, if you will, moving forward. It also helps us really broaden the discussion as much as possible. possible. So sharing it laterally, both internally and externally, and really helping others interpret what it means, not owning the knowledge that goes with it, but incorporating that shared learning across the organization. So ownership is important to us, is that we don't hold on to it. So the other challenge with that is then quite often you've got a bunch of very enthusiastic champions who've taken the document and are really excited about moving forward. What our challenge was is that we ended up having various groups going in opposite or sometimes conflicting directions. So we need to make sure that we're not spending a lot of time and energy cat herding, but really working as a murmuration of sparrows, if you will, or starlings that are really kind of building on that energy. So mix of groups and perspectives, sharing focus areas where we are not leading, but we're certainly supporting or participating, if not. So that's kind of the process that we've followed. Slightly different than the others. So when you look at our team, in contrast to the great work that Lillian did from the very technical perspective within her organization, her organizational group, the vast majority of folks that worked with us on the projections piece were outside of the organization. So they included the large forestry companies, DFO, First Nations, other levels of government, school districts, health authorities, and others. You won't see a lot of internal organization folks here because for many intents and purposes, this was simply too narrow a focus. The utilities group simply want to know what's my long-term storage capacity, those sorts of things. So we needed to do that broader work externally and then bring the specifics in the organization so that it was much more accessible to them. Our district is quite a bit different than the others insofar as it's primarily electoral areas. So for each one of these areas, we've got one political representative. We've got 4 municipalities with mayors and councils, 8 First Nations, many of them with multiple reserves. And for the most part, the area in blue is provincial crown land, sort of on the left side of the ENN land grant. Everything else is either fee simple residential properties or private managed forest land council areas. And that played a major role in how we would utilize this information going forward. We've got roughly 80,000 people. We have no growth strategy. And you'll notice that I haven't put up my political boundaries as the dominant feature here. It is watersheds. And we worked with Trevor, who was extremely patient with us, to try to not only nuance out the kind of the metrics of the projections, but also break it down so that it was more useful for us by these kind of main developed areas where the vast majority of our population lives, the water supply areas in green, and the West Coast watersheds in blue. For us, the water supply areas and the developed areas are incredibly important. The majority of water supply in our region is groundwater. However, we've got Cowichan Lake, which is a major input to the Cowichan River and impacts the viability of that system for fisheries production, and obviously all of the other associated issues. So it helped us really pull out what some of the information was in terms of gaining traction, making it more specific to folks because of the region bridging basically across the island. If we looked at the projections as they were, it didn't give us enough tangible information at the granular level. So incredibly important, particularly going forward. And so you see some of the projected changes here is, daytime temperatures, for example, but you'll see that they're expressed by each of the kind of the target analytical areas. And for us, some fairly substantial changes which impact water supply to a fairly substantial degree. It also impacts, if you consider the large portion of forested lands, it impacts the likelihood of large fires and how we might manage those lands in the future around some of the tension around burning versus land use management and the removal of timber. So some of the regional impacts, obviously ecosystems and diversity, not only within the developed areas, but the impacts on the larger watersheds themselves. Again, the numbers we're using on a daily basis at this point in terms of developing water supply models, doing forecasting for bulk water storage. We've just finished a major water use planning process for Lake Cowichan with an objective of potentially increasing storage capacity on that system. Obviously, there's a tension there with regards to potential impact of the growth areas around the lake and property owners. A lot of work with regards to infrastructure, particularly in the developed areas that are pulling from groundwater, looking at fallback systems for planning purposes. From an economic development perspective, we've got some fairly large agricultural opportunities, which we would certainly like to be able to support, yet at the same time we need to ensure that the water supply issues are addressed, particularly under the new Water Sustainability Act. How might that look? And again, the last piece around carrying capacity is important to us looking forward as we start to consider the development of a regional growth strategy. For some of our areas, particularly the southern area, so close to the Capital Regional District, it's become a bedroom community as the Malahats becoming a little safer to drive. And we're seeing some phenomenal growth in that area, which is putting our existing systems under stress, never mind what our future projections tell us is likely going to happen. So the role of the overall strategy in terms of the hope for outcomes is really around provision of information, changing the conversation in many ways around not just land use planning for development and economic purposes, but what the impacts of that may be in terms of strategic planning. Again, it's around increasing awareness within the organization. It's been quite interesting going through the asset management strategy for our region and applying the climate lens to that with the help of some consultants who did a fabulous job. It's interesting seeing the lights going on across the organization, saying, I didn't realize that I would be affected to such a great degree. How can I start to look at this very differently? Is this a benefit? Are there things that I can do in terms of management to change those impacts, or are there actually structural things that need to be addressed? So very positive in terms of allowing folks to actually learn at multiple paces and really supporting them and addressing how they may bring that information into their own management so that they in fact own it. They become the champions and the leaders within their own working groups. So very positive. So in terms of the next steps, or I would say the ongoing steps at this point, we're going through quite a bit of, based on the projections, risk assessment to our communities. And we've been extremely lucky in getting substantial support through the National Hazard Mitigation Program to do things like risk mapping, bringing up to date all of our coastal mapping. We've got quite a bit of floodplain mapping going on right now, looking at increased likelihood of effect to our communities based on the projected precipitation changes and the changes to temperature during some of the winter season. So flood issues. as well as fire issues. We've, as I said, brought it into our own asset management system and are starting to consider looking at a more nuanced discussion of level of service going forward, and discussions with the public in terms of how they feel about those issues. So one of the things that's come out of this is recognition that we need to be moving forward into more strategic planning around land use, regional growth, kind of limits to growth in some areas, but also defining our own policy framework with regards to risk and liability. We've got this information. How do we address it most effectively? And how do we communicate it in ways that we are not at odds with the community expectations for growth, but we are in fact working with them to reduce what those impacts may be in the future. The biggest tension that came out of it was, for our region, is the impacts on water, which are very, very substantial, and the relationship to land use planning and to land use activities in terms of resource extraction. So we were just successful in terms of the last election. We took a referendum question out to establish a new drinking water and watershed protection function that would allow us not to just deal with this as a project or an initiative off the side of the desk, but to put it in as part of our core function, core servicing going forward across the region. And so we were absolutely thrilled. We got a 66% assent last weekend to move forward on that across the region and to do it regionally as opposed to sub-regionally. So that's a very positive piece going forward in terms of how this information was utilized. Lastly, we also recognize, particularly in the review of all of the documents that we had originally looked at, is that it's important to make recommendations as you move forward and not wait to the very end of the process. So in the projections document, we inserted 10 recommendations, which the board passed immediately upon receiving the document itself. And we are either actioning or about to action all of those components. So we're building on the building, so to speak. And I think that's it for me. Yep, recommendations. Invite others, speak up. Sometimes it's hard at a more rural community setting, but if you do that with the partners, that's excellent. And there's no time like the present to start the process and to improve upon it at every step. That's it for me.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. Appreciate you sharing your experiences, particularly how it worked, and great to see the impact that's happened after the reports come out as well in terms of other specific actions. One of the themes that was all through your presentation was obviously the importance of collaboration in your region. So we just have a quick poll on that before we go to our final speaker, Jillian Obi-Vines, which is, whoops, oh, that didn't work. Okay, we're not going to have a poll because I pressed the button too quickly. The question was going to be about how often you collaborate on sustainability and climate change with others outside your organization. If you'd like to, instead of filling out the poll, since I can't recover it now, feel free to make any observations you have in the question box around how that's working with your organization, if you'd like to do more of that. Things that haven't gone well, whatever, those types of things, observations and thoughts around the importance of collaborating with others outside your organization, while we move to our next speaker, who Jillian Obi-Vines with Pinna Sustainability, who was the writer on all three of these regional reports, and sort of some of her observations on themes that cut across the three regions. So, Jillian, you're the presenter. Yeah, great.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. Can you see my screen?
You can see. You just have to put it into presentation mode, and we should be all set to go. Thanks.
Let me move this out of the way. Oh, is that working properly?
It was, yeah. There you
There
go.
we go. Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and thanks for sticking out. This is a long bunch of talking at you, so I appreciate all of your time and interest in this important work. My name is Jillian. I'm with PINA Sustainability, and I've had the pleasure of working with all three of these regions on their climate projections reports and a few others since then. And so the reason I've been asked to join the presentation is to talk a little bit about the differences between and the benefits from and the process of what it looks like to do this work. So I've been called the writer in the report, as my main role is really being Trevor's sidekick, really, and helping his clients interpret the science. So Trevor speaks the scientific truth, and there needs to be some level of translation. He's very funny and he's very good, but it also needs some level of working with the local context of what does this mean to the local context. So you can look at the numbers, you can look at the graphs, and to find that space in between what is locally relevant and where the story lies in the numbers. And so that's the role of the writer. So really it's bridging the technical with the local and puzzling out where the story is. Sometimes that has to do with, who is your key audience? Is it policymakers? Is it the public? Is it the water services department? You've heard different key audiences throughout the presentations this morning. So really trying to figure out how do you present the technical information, which in a way that meets or will communicate key messages to those audience. So translating science into the organizational context, the political context, supporting the interpretation of that science. So finding plain language to communicate clearly on what the local projection means. And then hosting conversations on impacts. This has come up as well. So how much do we just give the projections and leave it lie? And how much does every group want to go down the path of giving context on understanding what this means for the region? And that's a decision that everyone makes. We want to give some context to not leave people floating, but then we also don't want to present this as a comprehensive impact assessment. So there's sort of a line on hosting that conversation. And as Kate and others have pulled out, the journey is just as important sometimes as the end product. So in addition to being the writer, in some instances, I'm also sort of a process facilitator to support those conversations, to bring those key people up to date, to bring people who thought that climate change won't have an impact on their work into the conversation to understand what the projections mean to them. So understanding the local context. The outcome of all of this work is intended, and I think we've been successful to be clear and accurate in understanding the future climate. So there's a lot of nuance when you look at the technical information and trying to be very clear and in simple language, but very accurate about what is happening. And Lillian referred to the media misunderstanding around what does it mean to be, summers of future may look like San Diego. So, we want to make sure we're being very clear in the way we're describing things so people don't misunderstand or take it, go down a tangent with one little piece of information. So the outcome being clear and accurate. We want preliminary impacts to support further work, so get those conversations going, and to create a story that's going to resonate with the key audiences, be they political, be they internal, be they the public, whoever they may be. At the end of the project, we're looking to give folks what they need, give designers, planners, engineers, operational managers, in some cases with buildings, what they need to make informed decisions over time. So we've talked about 3 different approaches here, and there have been some others as well, which may be helpful to touch on. Lillian mentioned that Metro Vancouver began as a very internally driven product or audience at that time, where was the water management team or the water and sanitation department. Of course, it's grown since then, as we've seen, but that was the approach. So the work was really, Lillian was interviewing with internally and looking at the water and sanitation team, and we were supporting her directly with projections reporting and interpretation. CRD was a different story. It was a bit broader, so it was more cross-departmental process. There were, as was mentioned by, I won't go over it again, but we had groups from, or individuals from various groups across the CRD informing the conversation, taking that opportunity to really educate across the departments and then understand how the projections, be they temperature, precipitation, what have you, how it will have an impact across departments. So we had very detailed conversations around fish health in streams and very detailed conversations around the risk assessment and more of an internal conversation that then went out through the board and broad community towards the end. And then Kate's work, which you've just heard all about, was a very community-driven process. She showed the list of participants at the end. There were 30, 40, 50 people in a room, all going through, co-writing, trying to get their heads around what does this mean for their areas of work throughout the community, and how does that relate to the CRD in terms of role. So it was very much a community-driven process with municipal, regional, and community leaders participating. So 3 very different ways. Since then, we've also been we've done work with health authorities, and we're looking at more of a distributed internal model. So I think really these were 3 approaches that we had here, but the key message is, if you're thinking about doing this, you're thinking about who your core audience is and who needs to be involved in the conversation to start to move projects forward within your operating or your realm of responsibility. And I think that's really what has dictated some of the different approaches. This is just a slide that speaks to that importance of the message. Unlike many reports that I'm sure we all write, this is a very transformational message that we are sharing, and it's an important one to frame correctly because the public is interested, and we learned this through the process that we need to become more media savvy and understand how to share key messages with media as we go. And I would encourage you to think about that as well, because the projections, particularly towards the end of the century, can be alarming, and we want to make sure that we offer correct context, not to be alarmist, but to put context around it and understand what we can do now to take action. So I'll just give some general trends we've seen around the province. Oh, I see every time I click that, there we go. The general trends around the province. In these reports, we looked at precipitation and temperature. So wetter winters, drier summers, a change in annual distribution. So that means that even though temperatures are increasing over time, precipitation, we are in our regions, we're looking at around a 5% increase annually, but when that precipitation falls will change. So more intense storms and longer dry spells, more raining when it's happening, or more precipitation when it's happening, and longer dry spells when it's not happening. Summer temperatures in these regions were showing hotter days, warmer nights, and a longer growing season. Which was mentioned by, I believe, by Lillian, I think it was Lillian, that more cooling in the summer will likely be required. General trends on winter temperatures, warmer winter days and less frost. Nicky pointed out the frost-free CRD projections, and less snow as well in Metro Vancouver when they're thinking about their water, particularly their drinking water, and less heating required, which was also mentioned. And across the indicators, one thing that wasn't mentioned specifically, but is really important when we're thinking about climate change, is that we're looking at more variability and more intensity. And that is a key message, that when we're reaching different audiences, everyone has encountered a climate change naysayer, and they say, well, look at the temperature we had last year. It was so cold, we had so much snow in Vancouver, how could it possibly be warming? And that's where we point to the variability. So year to year, it's not the same. We're not on a linear path, but it's up and down. So these are some of the general trends that the reports point to, but you can see by these 2 maps that they're localized, are quite different. So here we see frost days, the change in frost days. The change is going to be more intense in the metro region than it is on the island. And depending on where you are in the region, what height or altitude you're at, it will have a change as well. So that's why in the Cowichan Valley, there was interest in splitting out the 3 subregions because it has a very different the change in frost days is very different depending on what your elevation is. So that's one reason why location matters. If you look at summer days, the same thing. So we're looking at general changes, but you can see this is an interesting map. If you look at the Fraser Valley, for those of you who weren't here, on the right is the Vancouver, and you've got the intense red that's around the Richmond area. That's the biggest change because Richmond currently is cool, or is not cool. It's affected by the ocean breeze, and so the biggest changes will be in that region. But if you go up, you follow that valley up towards the extremities, you can start to see that the colors are also strong, but they're not as strong because their baselines are higher. So that's another thing to think about is you have projections, but the intensity of those projections or the relative change will depend on where your baseline is. And that's just another one of those nuances that you need to work through as you're interpreting the science within your region. So some reflections, I just want to be cognizant of time here. So through these 3 reports, and we've done a handful of others in other regions and with municipal, but also some more institutional, so with health sectors and also with First Nations and the Great Bear Rainforest. We have some reflections on this work. Local stories are always different, and you think, well, we went over the general trend slide, we see generally what's happening, let's just go with that. But as has been described by the various presenters, our communities are all nested in their local environment. So, we're looking at a regional report. Every report has had a sub-region that they've looked at because of water, because of land, based on elevation. Also, in the Vancouver Coastal Health work we've been doing, the report was released last week, we've looked at site-specific locations. So for hospital designs and building systems, what you design on the North Shore of Vancouver is different than what you design for Richmond Hospital. So looking at, even though projections are general, the actual location is very important because the local thresholds vary, and that leads to social, economic, and environmental impacts varying as well. So I'd say that's key, and I put the puzzle pieces here again because it's it's the process of working through the projections, what's locally relevant, what is your area of authority, where do you have influence, how do we put those pieces together in a cohesive story to evoke action. The examples I won't go over, I think they've been pulled out in the other work. Around water resource management is very different in the Cowichan than it is in Metro Vancouver, for example. If you're on groundwater or if you're snow-dominated watershed, these things all are very different. Tourism economy is also different. If you're looking at snow sports and snow isn't around or is decreasing, then that's a change. Maybe it's a switch to another activity. Oftentimes people think about the growing season length as getting longer as a good thing, but again, as Kate mentioned, you need to think about water supply. So that's how these local stories are different. And then lastly, some recommendations from the work we've done to give local projections to your stakeholders. I think that finding the most direct path to give these projections to your stakeholders is helpful because, as Kate pointed out, it's a capacity development opportunity. Always thinking about your key messages for decision makers. In the report we're doing right now for the Northeast, we're really crafting a 2-page executive summary that's going to go to decision makers because that's the key audience in that region. So thinking about who it is you're trying to talk to and making sure you craft a report to meet that audience. And also follow with a planning process. This is the kind of process that gets conversations going and gets people thinking, and people want to take action after they hear this, and so it's a great time to follow up with, as has been happening across the regions with more risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, strategic planning and implementation work. So to follow on the momentum that this brings. Early action's best to prepare because obviously, as we look at the 3 trajectories that Trevor put out, the more mitigation we do now, and the earlier we get into including this information in our infrastructure design decisions, the better prepared we will be in the future. Even though, like Lillian said, it's hard to come up with one number, which is also often what designers want. Yeah, I would say consider your sensitivities and interdependencies between systems. This is all very interconnected. Even though we work departmentally in silos, we need to think beyond, which is why it's always good to have more people involved. and acknowledging that there is uncertainty in how these projections play out in terms of variability over time and where we're headed in terms of the RPC scenario. But we need to be able to respond with flexibility, and as decision makers managing infrastructure, it's important to keep that in mind, to build flexibility into your work. So that's some lessons I wanted to share with you today, and I thank you very much for your time and wish you well in your projection reporting and adaptation planning efforts.
Great, thanks very much, Jill. You've heard a lot of great information from our speakers here. I'm just going to go to one more quick poll before we go to you. I would like to hear, I'm sure this has raised questions for you, and we've got a great group of people to answer your questions. So if you've got a question that was spurred by any of the presentations or for one of the presenters specifically, feel free to use the question box to ask that question. But we're also interested in kind of what are the areas you work in. You can fill out more than one of these. You click as many boxes are relevant to you. And we're limited to 5 options for our poll, so there's obviously a lot more areas that we could include or would want to include, but this just gives us a snapshot of what people are working on that are participating in the webinar today. So I'll just share those results with you. And we can see that I was supposed to say the built environment, but built environment and energy systems comes out as the most important, but a number of others that are also very important: ecosystems, water supply and demand, and really everything. We've got some folks who are interested in working in that area. So I'm just going to those results, and yeah, I guess we're interested in any questions that you've got for our speakers. And someone noticed that yes, we are missing sea level rise and coastal flooding. It's a good point. We did have a built environment there, but obviously, yeah, it's hard to cover everything. So our first question for anybody who'd like to take it from Stuart Cohen is, what's the difference between communicating a climate indicator and communicating a change in risk to a community operated asset? Does anyone want to take that question? So the difference between communicating a climate indicator and the change in risk to the community assets.
It's Kate here. Maybe I'll start it off if that works.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think it's a great question, and it's really about nuancing the two pieces. The one is we're communicating the indicator. It's going to be what our projections are. It's going to be a change in temperature or a change in precipitation. What we do with that is then say, okay, let's roll it out in terms of what does that do in terms of the increased risk for, say, slope stability or issues or flooding. And once we've got that bounded, then we can really start working with the community with regards to how vulnerable is the community to that particular risk. What are the mechanisms that will help us reduce that risk, and to that way make it much more specific. So we're not just sort of talking about these vague generalities, but what does that mean right here at this particular period of time? So for example, I'll say if we have flooding in the winter season and we've got communities that are utilizing the lower floodplain areas because perhaps that's where there's a longhouse in the winter dance season, so we may have 1,000 people there for long periods of time. How do we get them out if there is an issue, as opposed to if there's an issue when there's really nobody there? Our reaction's quite different, and our mitigative or adaptive strategies would be completely different for those situations. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, I think that's quite useful. Thanks. I don't know if anyone else wants to contribute, or we've got another question here for Trevor. If you're able to respond, Trevor. So the question is, do you have any resource to support the Okanagan region? Any updates on climate projections for the region? I understand through the STEP code this was coming, but I'm not sure of the status.
Yeah, so a couple of things. We all of the kind of projects that were described here are really they're driven by the communities that approach us to do this kind of co-development where we're actively involved in multiple iterations of the reports. In terms of the future projections themselves, those are available for download on our website in a super not user-friendly way. So for highly technical users, they've been there for a while, but we're about to launch an updated regional analysis tool that anyone can use. So the projections themselves are coming. In terms of this type of project for the Okanagan, actually there's a couple. We're talking to the 3 regional districts in the Okanagan, and also to the health authority there about a pair of projects that might be happening at the same time. So you can look for something like this in that area. And then the last bit about that on STEP code, so that's independent of this kind of work. We've got a project on producing weather files for energy modeling, and so that's if you're doing building design for STEP code, I think that'll be more useful than sort of the tables of numbers, because the energy modeling that's part of STEP code really requires these weather files. So those climate shifted weather files. You can email me for more info about, or for getting we're in a early access stage to weather files, and it's the cost of using them is we'll use you as a guinea pig and ask you a bunch of questions about how you use them.
Okay. Yeah, one other question here for I guess for Lillian, and we might need a little bit of clarification around it, is I think this came from your observation that some people, perhaps engineers, are looking for a number so that they can design something. And so kind of how have you dealt with that, or what have the conversations been around designing new assets or those kinds of things? What specific information relative to climate impacts is guiding engineers and planners at Metro Vancouver in the development stage?
Sure. So the area that we've been working most on this is related to precipitation. And folks want those IDF curves, intensity, duration, frequency curves, so they can choose the amount of rainfall that would then get turned into a flow in a sewer, and needing to size a sewer or other kinds of, say, green infrastructure to absorb the flow. So when we were developing the climate projections report with PCIC, we were presenting a sort of average or median of all the climate models that were being used, and also showing a 90th percentile to show a kind of upper bound, and recommending that engineers actually look at both of those and assess the risks, the consequences, especially for high consequence infrastructure, and decide whether to use that 90th percentile. And so we've carried that type of approach forward in our IDF work, where we've got a moderate scenario and a high scenario. In that case, it's actually the 95th percentile to compare. In some cases, maybe it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of sizing infrastructure. In other cases, you might have to make a decision whether the costs and benefits outweigh each other. And another aspect that we didn't talk about, which I think came up just a moment ago, was in terms of sea level rise. We didn't include that in this climate projections report. It doesn't need the same kind of downscaling that PCIC was doing for us on temperature and precipitation. But that's another aspect in terms of design, getting a flood construction level that incorporates sea level rise along with future storm surge and other effects that need to be added to get your flood construction level.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's thanks for your perspective on that. We have one other question here that we might need a little bit of clarification on, but one of the participants, Tara, is wondering about project areas in rural island communities, or guidelines, I guess, that people might be able to use in smaller communities to create their own, I'm guessing, regional sort of information. So that might, yeah, need a little bit of clarification. I don't know if anyone wants to take that, or we can follow up with the person who's asked the question directly. But Trevor, do you have any thoughts around this one?
So we have one project on rural Vancouver Island right now with the Toquat First Nation that's just gotten started. But outside of, for in general, one of the sort of weaknesses of the approach that has been described about working with this, we end up working with the stakeholder, or with the users who have the most capacity already. So each of these projects you've talked about, took a while to get rolling. There's a lot of work and effort involved internally to all of the organizations for each of these projects. So we're aware of that. We're working on that. We actually we're going to be adding a staff person to help with that. So that person hasn't started, so I can't speak exactly to detailed plans about what that will look like, but we recognize that as a weakness in the the climate services that we're providing, and we're working on improving that. So in the next year, I think we should be better positioned to provide sort of general guidance for everyone else who doesn't necessarily have the capacity to carry out a project like this.
Great.
I can speak to that a little bit too. Because I've had it's Jillian here, because I've had the opportunity to work with Trevor on, I think I was just doing a quick count, I think over 15 projects, I've been able to take the projections, the regional projections from one project and share it with another. So for example, I work with the Great Bear Initiative Coastal First Nations, and based on our project with Vancouver Island Health, which Bella falls within that region, have been able to develop some short one-pagers and highlights. So without getting into all the detail here. And so I'm sure that over time that's the kind of thing that that Trevor would be able to do. It's not so much these are huge, not huge. These are significant efforts, but I think that there is a real opportunity, particularly with some resources that Trevor's talking about, to make it more sort of bite-sized pieces. Feel excited about that.
Awesome. Well, great to hear the new potential, and Trevor, that there is a potential for some additional support for smaller communities who are certainly already have less capacity. And great, thanks everyone, and thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their experiences here. We're coming up to 2:30, so I think we need to end our webinar. But just wanted to thank everyone: Trevor, Lillian, Nikki, Kate, and Jillian, and thank all of you for your great questions. And wish you all a really great afternoon, and look forward to our next webinar. Thanks very much, everyone.